I didn't need you. I proved it. That's all she said, before placing a letter on the table and walking out in silence. Moments later, someone screamed. A glass shattered. A woman ran from the room in tears, and then a fist flew. The brother punched the husband. The empire cracked, not from fire, but from truth. What could she have written in that envelope to unravel a family built on legacy and silence? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's the anatomy of elegant revenge. Cold, calculated, unspoken. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Because by the end, you may find pieces of yourself in her silence and in how she never looked back. Now let's begin. Dinner was quiet, not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that hummed with tension, heavy and brittle like glass on the verge of shattering. The long dining table at the Whitaker estate stretched too far between them, and the roasted duck lay untouched, cooling in the silence. Nathaniel sipped his wine like it was just another Thursday. Kemi barely moved. Her fork hovered above the plate, unmoved since the food was served. The clinking of silver echoed louder than words. She knew what was coming, but even knowing couldn't stop the sting. Nathaniel set his glass down with a soft clink, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her like he was about to deliver a weather update. You're nothing without my last name. The words didn't come with anger. They came with certainty, final, measured, brutal in their stillness. Kemi blinked once, but her expression didn't crack. Not yet, not in front of him. Not in this house where every camera, every wall, every wine glass had heard worse and said nothing. She didn't respond. Not a sigh, not a whisper. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a thick envelope made of ivory cardstock, and placed it gently next to her untouched plate. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. The letter rested between them like a loaded gun with no fingerprints. Nathaniel looked at it, smirked, then returned to his wine. He didn't even ask. She rose from her seat, pushing the chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the marble floor like a final verdict. The heels of her shoes tapped a quiet rhythm as she walked out of the dining hall. He didn't call after her. He didn't rise. He just sat there, smug in his assumption that she'd be back before dessert. But she wasn't coming back. The air outside bit into her skin. The estate loomed behind her, bathed in golden lights, perfect in its architecture and hollow in its soul. Her breaths came slow, steady. She walked past the rows of hedges shaped by paid hands, the fountain that never dried, and the security gate that only opened for the approved. Her driver waited without question. He opened the door, nodded once, and she slid into the back seat without a word. Inside the car, silence returned, but this time it belonged to her. Not him, not the house, not the family that had chewed her up and polished the bones. This silence was hers to carry, her armor. As the car pulled away, Kemi stared out the window, watching the world blur by like ink and water. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who once believed love could fix a legacy. That dedication would earn respect. That showing up, staying quiet, and working harder would eventually be enough. That girl had died somewhere between the 3rd anniversary gala and the 4th apology that came in diamonds instead of words. She remembered the first time she met Nathaniel. That smile, the way he made the rooms part around him, the way he made her feel like she wasn't just seen but chosen. She remembered believing it was real, believing he saw her. But Nathaniel never saw her. He saw potential. He saw the presentation. He saw the way she calmed chaos, made things run, smoothed his brand. She was his soft edge, his quiet asset, the elegant contrast to his empire. And when she outgrew the script, he turned cold, efficient, calculated. Kemi looked down at her hands, the same ones that built his charity events, wrote his speeches, and handled crises his PR team never even knew about. The same hands that held him through insomnia and ambition. Now they were empty, no ring, no regret. Just the soft print of ivory paper that had imprinted itself on her skin. She had written the letter days ago, not in rage, not even in grief, but in precision. She had laid out the truth without venom. Just facts, receipts, quiet power. She didn't name Helena. She didn't scream betrayal. She didn't have to. A single line had been enough to shatter him when the time came. The letter was never meant to be a plea. It was a ledger, the final audit, her closing argument. The car slowed as it left the estate grounds. The night opened wider, freer. Kemi leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. The weight she had carried began to shift. Not lifted, not gone, but no longer growing. She thought of his mother's words, of Helena's smirks, of every dinner where she was introduced last, complimented least, and acknowledged never. She thought of every time she had smiled through insult, every time she had accepted invisibility as a strategy. They never saw her as one of them, and Nathaniel, for all his sweet words in private, had never defended her in public. Her phone buzzed once. She ignored it. It would be him, or his assistant, or his sister. She didn't care. The message had been delivered. Outside, city lights came into view. Skyscrapers like jagged promises, streetlights blinking like Morse code from lives that still moved forward. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew what ended. When she finally reached her apartment, smaller and plainer, but hers, she didn't rush inside. She stood for a moment under the awning, letting the wind wrap around her shoulders. She took a deep breath, tasting freedom, bitter and cold. Upstairs, the apartment was quiet, lived in. A photo of her mother still hung near the door, crooked but steady. Kemi set her bag down, slipped off her coat, and stood in the center of the room, her heart still racing. She was gone, and this time, she hadn't left anything behind but the version of herself they wanted. The ivory envelope would wait for Nathaniel like a time bomb dressed in grace. He would read it, he would break, and she wouldn't be there to catch him, because he never caught her. The night after she left the estate, Kemi sat in her small kitchen, staring at the steam curling from her tea. Her fingers wrapped around the chipped ceramic mug like it was something sacred, something that hadn't been stolen. She had slept only 2 hours, and even that felt like a victory. For the first time in years, no one needed her to be ready by dawn. No gala, no crisis to fix before breakfast. Just silence and breath. But the peace was short-lived, because memories had a way of knocking harder than people ever did. Her childhood came back not in flashes, but in waves. Atlanta in the summer was sticky, alive, defiant. Kemi remembered riding her bike down cracked sidewalks lined with stubborn dandelions. The neighborhood buzzed with music and heat. Her mother, Dr. Afalabi, to her patients and simply Ma to her, worked nights and slept days, but still managed to make pancakes every Sunday. Not the fluffy kind, the strong kind, the kind that filled you like armor. Her mother had a way of looking at the world like it had dared her to survive, and every day she took that dare. Growing up, Kemi learned more from the back seat of her mother's beat-up Civic than in any classroom. That car had seen ER scrubs soaked in blood, church dresses stiff with starch, and one unforgettable argument about college that ended in quiet tears and a promise. Kemi would rise, no matter what. When Columbia offered her a full scholarship, her mother didn't cry. She simply nodded and said, "Don't let them forget your name." At Columbia, she didn't just study public policy. She dissected systems, racism, gender bias, economic traps. She tore them apart with surgical precision and then stitched up new models in her thesis, each one rooted in real lives, in girls who looked like her. She started a program mentoring Black high school girls into STEM fields, and in her senior year, she was invited to speak at the National Policy Summit. That was the night she met him. Nathaniel Whitaker entered the room like the air had changed for him. Tailored suit, platinum cufflinks. The Whitaker name alone made people stand up straighter. He was there for a keynote on philanthropic innovation. She was there as a wild card, a voice no one expected to move the room. But she did. When she spoke, the room didn't just listen. It leaned in. And when she stepped down from the podium, Nathaniel was already waiting. He complimented her clarity, her command, called her electrifying. And when he asked for coffee, she almost laughed. But something in his smile disarmed her. That night, they sat in a hotel bar, two worlds colliding over shared dreams and different currencies. He spoke of legacy. She spoke of change. He said she made him believe both were possible. For the first 6 months, she believed it too. He introduced her to his world. The foundations, the galas, the gated vacation homes. She floated through spaces that were never built for her, but with him at her side, she held her head high. He admired her intellect, her strength, her story, or so she thought. Slowly, the admiration bent into something else. He asked her to tone down her critiques at events, said it was not the place. He said her voice was important, but only in the right rooms. He bought her softer dresses, lighter lipstick, and shoes that hurt. At first, it felt like a compromise, but over time, it felt like a costume. Kemi caught herself speaking less in meetings. She started asking for approval before launching initiatives she once would have driven herself. And when she moved into the Whitaker estate, she boxed up more than her apartment. She boxed up pieces of herself. His mother was polite in the way that bruises could be polite. She smiled with her teeth, not her eyes. She spoke of tradition, legacy, and refinement. She once asked Kemi if her family still lived in that part of Atlanta. Kemi smiled, said yes, and added that her zip code didn't define her ambition. Nathaniel had laughed, a little too loudly, and changed the subject. The deeper she fell into the Whitaker world, the more invisible she became. She wasn't just the wife. She was the wife who smoothed over awkward silences. The wife who organized events that made millions but signed no credit slips. The wife who knew the wine preferences of board members and the allergies of every donor's spouse. But not once was she called partner. Now, in the quiet of her kitchen, she realized it had started long before dinner. The last straw had simply been delayed. Nathaniel hadn't built a life with her. He had constructed a stage, and she, in her perfect gown, had played her role. But she wasn't a role. She was Kemi Afolabi. She got up from the table, poured the rest of the tea down the sink, and wiped the counter clean. Her reflection in the window looked back at her with clarity, not defeat. The name Afolabi meant born into wealth in Yoruba, but for her, it meant grit, survival, legacy earned, not inherited. And she would carry that name into the fire ahead, with no one holding the matches but her. The first time Kemi met Helena Bradford, it wasn't at a formal dinner or some grand event. It was a private sit-down held in a glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the Whitaker Foundation's sprawling New York offices. The room smelled of polish and money, leather chairs, old books, fresh orchids that never wilted. Helena didn't rise when Kemi entered. She simply glanced up from her documents and extended a hand like she was doing Kemi a favor. There was no warmth in that gesture, just cold calculation cloaked in civility. Helena had been part of the Whitaker empire for over 3 decades. She wasn't a relative by blood, but might as well have been. Her influence ran deeper than tradition. She knew the intricacies of every investment, every scandal, every buried truth. She had mentored Nathaniel's mother, managed the family's trust, and curated their image with surgical precision. She didn't wear her power like a crown. She wore it like skin, undeniable, permanent. And the moment Kemi sat across from her, she felt it, that unseen wall of hierarchy. Helena began the conversation not with congratulations on the engagement, but with a document, a prenuptial agreement, thick, clinical, and final. It excluded Kemi from any claim to the Whitaker fortune. It bound her in silence about anything she might witness behind closed doors. And worst of all, it positioned her not as a partner, but as a tolerated presence. When Kemi hesitated, Helena said, "Women like you need to understand where they stand. This isn't personal, it's protection." That sentence echoed in Kemi's ears long after the ink had dried on the page. Protection. For whom? Helena spoke like she was safeguarding the empire from a threat, not welcoming a new member. The air had been thick with unspoken assumptions. Race, class, origin. Kemi's Ivy League degree and flawless public record meant nothing to this woman who had built her life judging threats by their surnames. After the wedding, Helena didn't fade into the background like most advisors might. She became omnipresent. Every major decision within the foundation bore her fingerprints. Kemi would propose initiatives, STEM programs for inner-city girls, educational reforms, mental health support for women of color, and each time, Helena found a way to shelve them. It's not the right demographic for our donors, she'd say. Or worse, it's admirable, dear, but let's focus on legacy projects. Nathaniel never intervened. He'd shrug, redirect conversations, or worse, laugh off Kemi's frustrations in private. Helena's just old school, she means well. But Kemi knew better. Helena wasn't clueless. She was deliberate. She curated the foundation's image to fit a mold that had no space for Kemi's truth. And the more Kemi pushed, the more invisible she became. At galas, Helena would often take Kemi's arm gently and reposition her away from donors. At press events, she ensured the camera focused on Nathaniel or his mother. When journalists asked about the foundation's operations, Helena was always the one whispering responses into Nathaniel's ear. Kemi, once a policy expert with vision, became a silent shadow. And yet she worked. Every spreadsheet, every strategy deck, every vendor negotiation had her fingerprints. But in meetings, Helena would glance her way only to say, "Could you take notes for us, Kemi?" Once, when Kemi tried to assert herself in a board meeting, Helena cut her off mid-sentence with a sip of tea and a smile. "Darling, perhaps leave the financial projections to the team. Why don't you focus on decor for the next gala? You have a lovely eye." The room chuckled. Even Nathaniel. That was the day something cracked. Helena wasn't just the advisor. She was the enforcer, the guardian of a legacy built on exclusion, and Kemi, no matter how educated, composed, or strategic, was never going to be one of them. The most devastating part wasn't the overt slights. It was the passive erosion of self, the slow chipping away of identity until Kemi could barely recognize the woman smiling in photos next to men who would never see her as an equal. Late one evening, after another gala where her name was omitted from the press release, Kemi sat alone in the rooftop garden of the foundation building. The city buzzed below, indifferent to her silence. She stared at the lights, remembering Atlanta, her mother's hands pulling double shifts, the scholarship letter from Columbia, the fierce pride she once carried in her name. Afalabi. She whispered it to herself like a lifeline. From the shadows, Helena's voice emerged, startling her. "You're too intelligent to play the victim, Kemi." Kemi didn't flinch. "I'm not a victim, just observant." Helena stepped closer, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Then you know your place here is conditional." Those words were meant to intimidate, but instead they sharpened something inside her. That night, Kemi didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat still, cataloging every microaggression, every dismissal, every betrayal. Helena thought she had broken her, but in truth, she had carved the edges of something harder. From that moment, Kemi began watching Helena with new eyes. She listened between the lines, tracked inconsistencies, noticed how Helena diverted funds, how she manipulated donor narratives, how she protected Nathaniel from scrutiny at the foundation's expense. And slowly, Kemi started documenting everything. By the time Nathaniel's betrayal would come to light, Kemi already had her strategy. Helena had underestimated the quiet girl from Atlanta, but Kemi had learned from the best. If Helena ruled with silence and fear, Kemi would answer with precision and truth. And unlike Helena, she wasn't protecting an empire. She was reclaiming her name. The sun hit the Bradford estate with a golden glow that betrayed the chill in the air. Every blade of grass was trimmed, every flower arranged like it had been placed by hand. And inside the grand dining room, the family brunch unfolded like a scene from a magazine, polished, poised, and hollow. Kemi sat in silence, her back straight, her smile polite, her eyes darting between gold-plated cutlery and two perfect smiles. The scent of rosemary and lemon drifted from the roast as laughter bounced across the table like a well-rehearsed performance. Then Nathaniel stood. He tapped his glass with a silver fork, the clinking sound slicing through the conversation like a scalpel. Every head turned. He flashed the smile that once melted her defenses, now barely stirred annoyance. "We have an announcement," he said, wrapping his arm around Kemi's shoulders without looking at her. "Kemi and I are expecting." The room erupted. Helena gasped and placed a hand over her chest. Evelyn, the mother-in-law, stood and clapped as if royalty had just been conceived. His brother and sister exchanged looks of glee. Someone raised a toast, but Kemi felt the air vanish from her lungs. Her pulse slowed, thudded once, then slammed in her ears. Her hands froze on the linen napkin in her lap. She turned to him, eyes wide. Expecting? She wasn't pregnant. Later in the corridor lined with ancestral portraits, she grabbed his wrist. Her voice dropped to a whisper as the applause faded behind the oak doors. What the hell was that? Her fingers trembled, her chest tight with confusion and rage. Nathaniel, calm as a lake in winter, smiled without warmth. Relax, he said. It's just strategy. We say we're expecting, the board gets soft, mother extends the family trust, you get visibility on the will. Everyone wins. Everyone but her. Her mind reeled. The lie wasn't just cruel, it was calculated, corporate. He had used her body, her name, her silence, and nobody noticed her falling apart. What no one at that table knew, what he had conveniently erased, was that there had been a child once. A flicker of life inside her that she'd carried alone, through exhaustion and insomnia, while juggling his galas and foundation events. It was during a fundraiser he insisted she oversee, the same night she fainted in the bathroom between speeches, that she lost it. No one asked where she had been that weekend. Nathaniel never noticed the tremble in her hands or the blood on the hotel towel she disposed of quietly. The doctor's voice was kind but clinical. Stress-related, he said. You need rest. But there was no rest in the world she had been pulled into. There were only expectations, deadlines, and optics. And when she finally told Nathaniel, he had blinked, then offered a hug as if she had canceled a reservation. Next time, he'd said, as if children were events that could be rescheduled. The brunch replayed in her mind like a sick joke. The flowers, the applause, the congratulations for a pregnancy that didn't exist. Kemi sat alone in her home office that night, still dressed in pastel pink from the brunch, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop. Her chest felt hollow, her stomach sore, not from illness, but from grief that had no audience, no sympathy. She opened the drawer. Inside was the sonogram photo she had never shown anyone. She touched it gently, then tucked it back under the documents. No one needed to know. This pain, like every other sacrifice she made, would be archived, unspoken, and buried beneath the facade of a life well lived. But this moment marked a shift. Something uncoiled inside her, slow, deliberate. It wasn't just sadness, it was recognition. A realization that she had been grieving more than a child. She had been mourning herself, the woman with dreams and dignity, and a name she once wore like armor. That name now sat somewhere on invitation cards, invisible beneath Mrs. Whitaker. That night, as Nathaniel kissed her forehead and retreated to his private study, she sat at the window, watching shadows spill across the garden. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, only a plan forming slowly, like mist solidifying into rain. The next morning she smiled when he handed her a smoothie, pretending nothing had happened. She thanked him, drank half, and flushed the rest. He left for a board meeting, and she closed the door softly behind him. Her hand rested on her abdomen. There was no child. There was no truth in this house. But she would not let this lie define her any longer. In her studio, surrounded by event mood boards and foundation reports she had meticulously prepared, she sat at her desk and wrote a single sentence on a blank page. He used my womb as currency and my silence as collateral. The line bled into the paper, like truth seeping through fabric. She didn't know what the full letter would look like yet, but the seed had been planted. Outside, the Bradford estate glimmered with illusion. Inside, Kemi finally began reclaiming what they all thought she had lost. Her will, her sense, her voice. It was supposed to be a simple evening. Kemi had returned early from the Whitaker Foundation after feigning a migraine. The house was quiet, the type of silence that pressed into her skin like a warning. Nathaniel was away on business. At least that's what his assistant had said. Kemi wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. In the guest room, shoved behind dust-covered luggage and old winter coats, was a suitcase she hadn't touched since the honeymoon. She opened it absent-mindedly, expecting nothing but stale air and forgotten clothes. But there it was, her old travel iPad, wrapped in a navy leather case. The device was scratched but intact. She tapped the power button. The screen blinked, battery low, still alive. She carried it to her desk, plugged it in, and stared as it came to life. The soft glow of the login screen felt like a portal, harmless, even nostalgic. Her passcode still worked. Everything synced. Photos, notes, text messages. She scrolled absent-mindedly, drifting through years of curated perfection, anniversary dinners, charity events, selfies beside men who barely saw her. But then, a notification flickered, a message, then another, all from the same number. She froze. Her fingers hovered above the screen. The texts weren't addressed to her. They were part of a long thread, hidden in the depths of Nathaniel's Apple ID that had remained linked after a careless oversight. Kemi tapped the thread. What unfolded was a gallery of betrayal. Videos, screenshots, voice notes, a stream of affection, vulgarity, and conspiracies between Nathaniel and Helena's niece, who also happened to be the wife of Nathaniel's younger brother. Kemi recognized her immediately from last Christmas dinner, the same woman who had once complimented Kemi's dress while holding her hand a second too long. There were pictures in hotel rooms, recordings from Zoom calls where Nathaniel mocked board members, and in one particularly clear voice message, he laughed. Kemi's just dead weight. I needed someone respectable, someone quiet, but God, it's exhausting pretending to care. Kemi didn't blink, didn't cry. She sat upright, a statue in a room that suddenly felt too cold. Her heartbeat didn't race. It slowed. She played the voice note again. Dead weight, pretending to care. He said it so casually, like ordering coffee. Her eyes moved to a photo. Nathaniel shirtless, the woman wrapped in sheets, kissing his neck. Time stamped. During the weekend of Kemi's miscarriage. The screen blurred for a second, not because of tears, but because the fury was so clean. It burned. No screaming, no throwing devices against the wall. Just an almost inhuman stillness. She picked up her journal and wrote a date. Nothing else. Then she stood, walked to the closet, pulled out a shoebox filled with donation receipts, memos she had co-authored, and board decisions she had quietly influenced. Every page was a breadcrumb leading back to her hands. She had been erasing herself from their world for so long, she almost forgot how much of that world she had built. In the kitchen, she brewed chamomile tea because routines helped her think. The soft clink of the spoon against porcelain reminded her that she still had control over her hands, her breath, her name. Afalabi. She whispered it like a spell, grounding herself. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, she had archived every incriminating message and voice file. She backed them up to 3 separate drives, one for her attorney, one hidden, one on her person. She labeled them in Yoruba. Nathaniel wouldn't be able to decode it. When she heard the garage door open, she didn't flinch. She left the iPad face down on the guest bed. Nathaniel walked in, loosened his tie, and kissed her on the cheek. She smiled. He asked how her day was. She said fine. He talked about a potential merger. She nodded. He didn't notice the chill in her voice. That night, he fell asleep within minutes. Kemi watched him in the dark, not with sorrow, not with hate, but with a clarity she had never allowed herself before. The man lying beside her wasn't a husband. He was a mask, a disguise worn by ambition. She slipped out of bed and returned to the study. She opened her laptop and began typing a letter. Not one of confrontation, but documentation. Every lie had a timestamp. Every betrayal has a paper trail, and she was going to collect them all. The morning after the discovery, Kemi stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapels of her charcoal blazer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, every thread of fabric a silent rebellion. Nathaniel was still asleep, sprawled across Egyptian cotton sheets like a man at peace with the world. She didn't wake him. He wouldn't notice her absence, not today, not ever again in the same way. Outside, the air was crisp with early spring. The estate driver greeted her with a nod, opening the door to the car she had once asked permission to use. Today, she didn't ask. She didn't explain. She simply slid into the back seat and whispered, "Downtown." In the city's financial district, the Whitaker Foundation towered like a monument to philanthropy. Glass, steel, and perfectly rehearsed lies. Kemi walked past the security guards who barely acknowledged her presence, even though she had designed the foundation's entire outreach strategy from scratch. Her heels echoed through the marble lobby. Each step whispered, "Not invisible anymore." On the 12th floor, she entered her old office. It had been reassigned to an intern 6 months ago. No name on the door, no trace of her, but they'd forgotten to revoke her credentials. She logged into the system, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with an ease that startled even her. The foundation's core files were intact: donation pipelines, project blueprints, private emails between board members. And Kemi knew where to look. She had created the folder structures. She had named the protocols. What others would miss, she knew by instinct. She wasn't looking for revenge. Not yet. She was building a timeline. At noon, she met Lila, the intern she once protected during a harassment investigation. Lila had been demoted after Kemi's influence faded. Now she stood awkwardly in the coffee shop's corner booth, clutching a flash drive. Her eyes flicked around nervously. "I don't want to get involved," she whispered. "You already are," Kemi said calmly, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Inside was a glowing recommendation letter and a direct referral to a top firm in Chicago. "All you have to do is hand me that drive and forget you saw me." Lila hesitated, then pushed the device forward. Back home, Kemi sealed herself inside the study. She backed up the data from Lila's drive: internal communications, financial reroutes, memos signed by Nathaniel but ghostwritten by Kemi. Everything was dated, everything traceable. In the drawer where Nathaniel kept correspondence from donors, she found what she was looking for: a copy of the prenuptial agreement. Helena's edits were still in red ink. Every clause dripped with assumption. Kemi was a placeholder, a liability, a tolerated accessory. She traced one line with her finger: no claims to assets, regardless of contribution. She smiled, because she had contributed everything. At midnight, she began composing the letter. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't an attack. It was structured like a financial report: objective, clear, and damning. She started with her role in scaling the foundation's outreach by 400% over 3 years. Then came the timeline: events, contributions, dates. At the end, a single paragraph broke the format. She described the woman Nathaniel held the night before last. She didn't name her. She didn't scream. She simply wrote, "The person you clutched in that room shares a name with your brother. That's all I'll say." Then she signed it, full name: Kemi Afolabi, no hyphen, no Whitaker. She printed 2 copies. One she sealed in an envelope, placed neatly inside Nathaniel's favorite cufflink box. The second she tucked into a folder marked for legal review. She wasn't done yet, but this was her first move. Over the next few days, Kemi's silence became her sharpest weapon. She smiled during dinners, offered comments at fundraisers, and nodded at board members. But beneath the facade, she was erasing herself from their narrative, while rewriting it from the inside out. She disconnected her email from the foundation server, rerouted her calls, and notified her attorney. Every act was surgical, precise. She wasn't reacting. She was preparing, and nobody saw it coming. Even Helena, queen of calculation, seemed placated. During a board luncheon, she leaned in and said, "Good to see you smiling again. We were worried you might crack." Kemi tilted her head. "Cracks let the light in." The old Kemi might have flinched. This Kemi sharpened every silence into a blade. The Grand Whitaker estate shimmered under the glow of 1,000 lights. Crystal chandeliers danced above the heads of guests dressed in silks and diamonds. The annual gala had always been a symbol of opulence, tradition, and power. But this year, something was different. An unease rippled through the air, subtle yet inescapable, like the silence before a storm. The estate had seen its share of spectacle, but tonight there was a tension that laced the laughter and weighed behind every clink of glass. A tension that no one could name, yet everyone felt. Kemi stood just outside the iron gates, her breath calm despite the turmoil that had shaped her in recent months. Her fingers curled tightly around a cream-colored envelope, its corners worn from being held too long. She wore an emerald silk dress that clung to her with quiet defiance, tailored perfectly to reflect both elegance and command. Though she held no invitation, she walked with the poise of someone who no longer sought approval. She wasn't crashing the party. She was reclaiming her place. The same gates that once welcomed her as an accessory to Nathaniel now stood between her and a final, deliberate act of clarity. Inside, the ballroom pulsed with soft classical notes, while laughter and politeness painted the air with a practiced gloss. Nathaniel floated among the guests with ease, his tuxedo crisp, his smile convincing. Helena stood near the fireplace, a glass of vintage wine in her hand, eyes ever sharp, scanning the room like a general surveying her territory. Conversations flowed, deals whispered in corners, gossip dressed as compliments. No one noticed the subtle shift, but like a current of cold air in a warm room, it soon became impossible to ignore. One by one, heads turned. Kemi had entered. Her presence was not loud, but it was undeniable. The marble floor echoed beneath her heels, each step intentional and firm. The train of her green gown flowed like liquid courage. She didn't look left or right. She had once restored these very walls with her bare hands and refined taste, once breathed life into the decor of events others took credit for. But tonight, she was no longer a silent contributor. She was a reckoning. Nathaniel's eyes found hers and his jaw tensed. He took one step forward, lips parting as if to speak, but Kemi was faster. Before Helena could intercept, before whispers could build into questions, Kemi stopped in front of him. Without a word of greeting, she placed the envelope gently onto the silver tray of a passing waiter. Her voice, calm and edged like glass, cut through the murmur of the room. "This one's for you. Read it before midnight, or don't. The clock still moves." She turned, a movement slow enough to be seen, fast enough to deny interruption. Her former mother-in-law's voice sliced through the gathering air like the shriek of a violin. "What is the meaning of this?" But Kemi didn't look back. Her silence was her weapon. In a family that used power as conversation and silence as control, Kemi had learned well. Tonight, silence belonged to her. The waiter handed the envelope to Nathaniel, who opened it with cautious hands. Inside was a single sheet. His eyes scanned the words and the color drained from his face. His hands shook. Helena stepped closer, straining to see, but she was too late. Gasps erupted around them like dominoes. One woman dropped her glass. Another backed into a table. The illusion, carefully curated and cruelly maintained, shattered. A sudden scream tore through the room. The sister-in-law, face drained of blood, stumbled back. Her husband, Nathaniel's younger brother, stepped forward with clenched fists and fury in his veins. The punch landed before anyone could intervene, cracking across Nathaniel's jaw like thunder. Chaos erupted. Cries, movement, disbelief. Champagne spilled. Crystal shattered. And in the eye of the storm, Helena stood paralyzed, lips parted but silent for once. But Kemi was already gone. She had left the moment her purpose was fulfilled. She hadn't come for confrontation or applause. Her work was done in precision, her truth delivered without drama. She exited as she arrived, with elegance sharpened into resolve. Her power was never about spectacle, it was about a decision. Outside, the air was crisp, scented with magnolias and night. Kemi walked slowly down the gravel path, her heels clicking a rhythm of release. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. The envelope had been a key, not a weapon. She had nothing more to prove, and the house behind her no longer held power over her. Her voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. "I didn't burn it. It collapsed." The black car waited at the curb, engine purring, as if it too had been holding its breath. She slipped into the back seat, exhaled, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself stillness. She unlocked her phone, not to check headlines, but to stare at the reflection on the screen. Her face looked the same, but something deeper had shifted. She didn't look like someone who had lost. She looked like someone who had been found. The driver adjusted the mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" She answered without hesitation, eyes on the horizon. "Anywhere but here." As the car drove away, the estate faded into the distance. It did not explode. It did not crumble. It simply receded, like a tide that had taken too much for too long. The morning after the gala was not filled with headlines, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm that did not roar, but swallowed everything in its wake. Kemi sat at the edge of her modest apartment's balcony, a notebook open on her lap, her curls still damp from the shower. The sky stretched out above her, pale blue and endless, as if waiting for her to name it. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the weightlessness that came with finally letting go of the anchors that once kept her submerged. For the first time in years, her name sounded like hers again. No hyphens, no shadows, no borrowed prestige, just Kemi Afolabi. The name felt strange yet powerful. It wasn't stitched into linen napkins or engraved on golden plaques, but it rang true every time she said it aloud. In the solitude of this rebirth, Kemi began mapping out what would become her legacy, not one born of her husband's name or his family's wealth, but one born of scars turned into vision. The brand came to her like a whisper, Afolabi, a name too strong to be silenced, too bold to be erased. It would not just be a business, it would be a declaration. She rented a small sunlit co-working space on the east side of the city, far from the polished conference rooms of the Whitaker Foundation. The building smelled of old wood and coffee, its windows smudged but open to light. Here, among the hum of ideas and the tapping of laptops, Kimmy found her rhythm again. She pulled out every document she had ever touched. Proposals ghostwritten, decks presented under another's name, budgets built from sleepless nights, and she began reorganizing them under her name, her narrative. Media outlets began to notice the subtle shift, the disappearance of the woman once seen at every Whitaker fundraiser. A few reached out. Kemi ignored them. She wasn't ready to be a story. Not yet. Investors came knocking, too, curious about the projects she had supposedly co-managed. Some remembered her from Colombia, where she once spoke with conviction about policy, equity, and systems change. She didn't say much during those calls. She didn't have to. The confidence in her silence did the speaking. Her first product, under the Afolabi name, was not a statement dress or a luxury item, but a campaign. It spotlighted young Black women in STEM, telling their stories in polished short films, not as charity, but as a promise. She knew the system too well to pretend it could be fixed overnight, but she also knew that visibility mattered, and so did money. The campaign gained traction not because it was loud, but because it was truthful. It didn't ask for pity, it demanded respect. Word spread. Former colleagues who had once dismissed her began reaching out, curious about collaboration. She didn't forget their silence when she needed them most, but she didn't hold it against them either. She had moved past the hunger for revenge. Now she was fueled by something far more sustainable. Vision. Her team grew, small but committed. A few women she mentored years ago, some interns who remembered her kindness, joined with eager hands and sharp minds. They brought skills, passion, and, more importantly, belief in the mission. Helena, meanwhile, was suspended from her advisory position after internal audits questioned her management decisions. The family board, once loyal to her every word, now scrambled to preserve their image. And Nathaniel, stripped of financial control and publicly humiliated, retreated from the public eye. There were whispers of rehab, lawsuits, and press blackouts, but Kemi paid them no mind. She didn't need confirmation of his downfall to validate her rise. She no longer existed in response to him. Instead, she stood on stages, her voice amplified through microphones and across screens. Her words didn't ask for attention, they commanded it. She didn't adjust her natural curls for acceptability anymore, nor did she lower her voice to sound less threatening. She spoke with the weight of someone who had been silenced and now knew the cost of every word. People listened, not out of guilt, not out of trend, but because what she said was necessary. She reconnected with her mother, who had quietly followed her journey from afar. The reunion wasn't dramatic, but filled with a kind of mutual recognition, of battles fought in silence, and victories won in private. Her mother said little, only held her hands and whispered, "Now you walk like you own your name." It was the blessing Kemi didn't know she had waited for. The press tried to paint her as the woman who destroyed the Whitakers. Some called her a disruptor, others a rebel. But Kemi didn't claim any of those titles. She corrected them only once, in a rare interview when she said, "I didn't destroy anything. I simply walked away. The collapse was theirs to own." Her story became a case study, her campaign a model. But beyond the accolades and the headlines, Kemi focused on the women who showed up at her door, young, hungry, often afraid. She remembered what it felt like to be them. So she taught them not only how to lead, but how to stand, how to walk into rooms without shrinking, how to speak their names as declarations, not questions. Afolabi became more than a brand. It became a shield, a flag, a home. And yet, even as her world expanded, Kemi kept a small piece of that cream-colored envelope tucked in her journal. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of the line she once drew. That night in the Whitaker estate, she didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply stated her truth and then walked away. It was the night her silence roared louder than any scandal. The final launch of Afolabi's global platform took place in a minimalist glass gallery downtown, attended by journalists, investors, and students. She stood under the soft light, surrounded by pieces of work that were no longer ghostwritten. This time, her name was etched into every surface. No one else's fingerprints claimed her legacy. She spoke last that evening, and her voice did not shake. "This is not a brand," she said. "This is a restoration, not of what they took, but of what was always mine." And when the crowd applauded, not for the first time, but perhaps for the truest, Kemi didn't bow. She stood tall, eyes open, chest unburdened, because she had not just reclaimed her life, she had renamed it. The conference hall glowed beneath steel beams and arched glass, sunlight pooling across polished floors like liquid gold. Flags from around the world fluttered in silent pride, anchoring the room with a sense of global gravity. It was the International Women in Leadership Summit, and Kemi's name sat at the top of the keynote roster. Bold, unapologetic, unmissable. Rows upon rows of chairs filled with changemakers, executives, and rising voices. Yet there was a unique stillness as her name was announced, a collective breath drawn in anticipation. Backstage, Kemi stood in quiet calm, her natural curls coiled into soft defiance, and her slate blue suit tailored to her new silhouette of self-possession. She did not glance at the teleprompter. She did not fidget. Her voice, long silenced in corridors of wealth and manipulation, had been sharpened by betrayal, polished by truth, and was now ready to echo in spaces that once ignored her presence. As she stepped onto the stage, applause erupted, some enthusiastic, some tentative, but all acknowledging. She paused center stage, let the silence return, and then began. Not with a quote, not with a prepared note, but with memory. "There was a time when I thought value came from staying silent, from being agreeable, from being indispensable to people who would never call you irreplaceable." The words landed like stone on still water. No theatrics, only weight. She walked slowly as she spoke, her voice neither raised nor rushed, but each syllable was iron. She did not need to name names. Her story, embedded in every pause, resonated beyond the need for detail. The audience leaned in, not just to hear, but to witness. The woman who once blended into background noise was now the signal. Cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing not just beauty, but resolve. Her skin glowed, not from makeup, but from liberation. She was no longer Kemi Whitaker, appendage of power. She was Kemi Afolabi, founder of Afolabi, an enterprise born not out of revenge, but of reclamation. Luxury for women of color by women of color, a name that meant origin, not aftermath. Her company had launched just 3 months prior, but already it had disrupted every expectation. Publications tried to frame it as the result of a scandal, but her numbers silenced skepticism. Investors previously silent now sought appointments. Collaborators, once distant, extended partnerships. But the real triumph wasn't headlines or funding. It was that she did it under her name, her vision, her terms. She narrated her rise not as a phoenix from ashes, but as a woman who refused to be extinguished. "They thought silence would keep me tame. They thought a contract could erase my contribution. But here's the truth. Power built on someone else's back isn't power. It's theft." The room responded, not with noise, but with stunned reverence. Because in Kemi's voice was every woman who'd been overlooked, used, or dismissed. In the fourth row sat a man, Nathaniel. No entourage, no title tag, just a face drained of the confidence it once wore as armor. Their eyes did not meet. She never acknowledged him, because closure, Kemi had learned, is not confrontation, it's indifference. As she closed her speech with a call for legacy, not survival, she spoke the final line not to them, but for herself. I am no longer part of their empire. I am building my own, brick by brick, and I will never look back. The standing ovation began slowly, almost sacred, and then crescendoed into thunder. But Kemi simply smiled, nodded once, and walked off stage. Not into shadows, but into the light she had created. Backstage, a young woman, barely out of college, waited with trembling hands and wide eyes. Ms. Afolabi, she stammered, your words, they made me feel seen. Kemi rested a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. Then speak. Don't wait for permission. Make them listen. The two walked down the hallway side by side, one rising, one risen. Behind them, the hall buzzed with possibility. Ahead of them, the world waited, not to define them, but to witness them. Outside the venue, the city pulsed as usual. Cars honked. Light flickered through the trees. But something had shifted, even if the world didn't yet realize it. A woman had reclaimed her name, and in doing so, she had rewritten the terms of power. Because in the end, Kemi didn't destroy anything. She simply chose not to belong. And when she walked away, everything they built on her silence collapsed without a sound. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Kemi's journey. If this story stirred something in you, rage, hope, strength, we'd love to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in her place? And if Kemi's voice resonated with yours, consider sharing this video so someone else might feel seen too. Don't forget to subscribe to catch more powerful stories like this, because some voices deserve to be heard. Until next time, take care and never settle for silence.